Hello guys, I'm Tom, and today we're going to find out who Immortan Joe really is. In the ruthless and dusty universe of Mad Max, few villains have managed to leave as deep a scar as Immortan Joe. Behind that terrifying mask and his ghost-like appearance hides the man who was once known as Colonel Joe Moore, a leader whose ambition and brutality shaped the Wasteland into his own kingdom of iron and fire, where only the strongest and most fanatical thrive. This charismatic despot is the twisted mastermind who built the dreaded Citadel, becoming the central figure of Mad Max. Fury Road and returning stronger than ever in the recent film Furiosa, which expands his dark legend and reminds us how far the thirst for power can go when combined with the madness of a lawless world. Before the world crumbled into dust and ruins, Joe wore the rank of colonel, hardened by conflicts as crucial as the water wars and the oil wars, battles that determined the fate of millions. It was on those unforgiving battlefields that he forged his reputation as a ruthless strategist and amassed a private arsenal, ensuring that when civilization collapsed, he would be ready to take what others wouldn't even dare to dream of possessing. Armed with that power, Joe gathered his own band of wild riders, a horde of desert-hardened bikers, unafraid of death and thirsty for plunder, among them such lethal figures as Major Kalashnikov, a veteran expert in tactics and weapons, and Deep Doc, a calculating mastermind who expanded Joe's plan for domination like a network of steel and gasoline. It didn't take long for them to impose their will on other warlords of the Wasteland, raiding camps and seizing fuel, women, and territories by force, leaving behind a trail of bodies, fire, and dust. Under his sick vision of absolute order, the only way to bring structure back to a broken world was to crush it first under his iron fist and rebuild it from the ashes. With every victory, Joe cemented his myth among his followers, who saw him not just as a military leader, but as a brutal savior willing to do what others feared to even imagine. What began as a mere warlord transformed into an almost prophetic figure for his fanatics, who worshipped him as a strong and merciless redeemer, capable of giving them a reason to survive in the void. His army grew like a swarm of locusts, and with it, his influence spread like a tumor through the endless desert and the great nothing, where no human law could reach him. But Joe Moore was not a simple tyrant, content to survive the end of the world. Having known the opulence and corruption of the previous era, his ambition aimed at something much greater: to rebuild an entire civilization under his absolute rule, with himself sitting at the top, deciding who lived, who died, and who served. It was this obsession that drove him to build an empire in the Australian wastelands. Joe understood better than anyone that the key to maintaining his rule was to control what was indispensable: food, fuel, and above all, water. When his supplies began to run dry, word of a vast underground source hidden beneath an almost impregnable fortress, the Citadel, changed his fate forever. A man known as the Fat Man, a treacherous traitor, sold him the information in exchange for his miserable life and a few cans of gasoline. Joe first tried the diplomatic route, offering to trade supplies, fuel, and women for access to the water. But the inhabitants of the Citadel, desperate for their own survival, rejected the offer and responded with betrayal, ambushing his band and making it clear there would be no truce or negotiation. Upon seeing the betrayal, Joe unleashed all his military cunning. He sent scouts who discovered an old abandoned refinery and a lead mine, perfect resources to sustain a prolonged war. At the same time, he ordered slaves from conquered tribes to scale the fortress walls, disposable cannon fodder to clear the way for his best men. Inspired by the legend of Tanai Malice, a Persian conqueror who used animals to scale enemy walls, Joe devised an unusual plan: to train a desert lizard to climb with a rope tied to it. When the animal refused, one of his men, as fanatical as he was, amputated a finger to use as bait. the lizard climbed, securing the rope and allowing Joe's warriors to ascend under the cover of darkness. On a night of shadows and scorching winds, Joe led his army. While his troops laid siege to the base from below, he and his elite infiltrated over the walls, plunging the fortress into unstoppable chaos. Although the defenders destroyed the main bridge and held out barricaded in the towers, after days of bloody skirmishes and explosions, Joe emerged triumphant. From the top of the main tower, he proclaimed his victory to a trembling crowd. The Citadel was his, and with it, the water and the power to decide who lives and who dies. It was then that the legend of Immortan Joe, the immortal man, absolute sovereign of a broken world, was born. With control of the Citadel, Joe solidified his empire like a fortress of iron and dust. He rebuilt his domains, reactivated the northern refinery, which he named Gastown, and handed it over to the Fat Man as a reward for his useful betrayal. He restarted the exploitation of the lead mine, turning it into the dreaded bullet farm, under the command of the relentless bullet farmer, none other than Major Kalashnikov with a new name forged in gunpowder. His fame spread like fire through dry scrubland. Hordes of the dispossessed, the wretched, made pilgrimages to the Citadel in search of scraps of water and a slightly less miserable life. The strongest and most useful were turned into milk mothers, breeders, mechanics, or the fearsome war boys, his personal army of suicidal fanatics, ready to immolate themselves for the glory of their leader. To guarantee his supremacy, Joe built crop farms, potable water reservoirs, and true blood banks. Humans chained and drained like cattle, living reserves of plasma for his sick and wounded warriors. Together with his entourage of mechanics and motor alchemists, he developed aquacola, a drink that required only a fraction of real water, extending the life of his wells and feeding the illusion of abundance. Little by little, the devotion toward him transformed into a delirious and suicidal cult. His war boys worshipped him as a god of metal and dust. They shaved their heads, painted themselves like specters, and decorated their skin with death symbols, imitating the reaper they so longed to meet. Fanatics of speed, violence, and final glory on the road, these warriors became the living embodiment of Immortan Joe's absolute power, the crowned specter ruling over a world with no hope, no mercy, and no happy ending. In the arid and ruthless world of Mad Max, the war boys are more than mere soldiers. They are cannon fodder and the living reflection of Immortan Joe's madness. From the moment they see the light in that society deformed by violence, these young warriors carve symbols into their skin and cover their faces with the iconic white skull. Each stroke is a declaration of faith. For them, there is no greater glory than giving their lives in battle for their immortal master and earning a seat in Valhalla, that mechanical paradise where, according to their fanatical belief, eternal engines roar alongside Joe as brothers in arms and witnesses to the perpetual roar of the road. Behind Immortan Joe's mask of terror hides an architect of domination. Through brutal order, this warlord built an empire sustained by the Citadel, the bullet farm, and the fuel plant, fortresses that ensure every drop of water, every bullet, and every liter of gasoline answers only to his will. Each structure was another chain to bind his people's will, who, desperate for a sip of water or a scrap of meat, became pawns in his ruthless machine. And although his rule was marked by the whip and fear, Joe kept alive a cruel illusion of upward mobility. Anyone willing to swear blind loyalty could rise in rank, as long as they sacrificed their humanity without hesitation and left behind any trace of doubt or compassion. But Joe's tyranny was not invulnerable. Decades of bloody reign and broken pacts eventually pushed him into a direct clash with Dementus, a relentless bandit determined to challenge him for the Citadel, the crown jewel of his domain. This clash of titans is precisely the heart of Furiosa, The film that reveals the storm of betrayal, fire, and vengeance that would mark the beginning of the end. Behind the facade of immortality, Joe was nothing more than a veteran of 1,000 battles, wounded and rotting from the inside. Radiation, toxic storms, and countless wars had reduced him to a body oozing with sores, burns, and failing organs. He needed a respirator to survive, always hidden behind a metal-jawed mask that gave shape to his legend. Beneath that transparent exoskeleton, reinforced with tubes and valves, and his ghostly mane that floated like a banner of death, hid a man who knew that time was devouring him with silent bites. That certainty of his end drove him to forge his legacy at any cost, no matter how many corpses he left behind. Although he had heirs like Rictus Erectus, none embodied the mix of coldness, strength, and magnetism he believed essential to sustain his empire of water, fire, and gasoline. Thus his most twisted plan was born: the wives. Young women kept away from dust and contamination, raised with pure water, abundant food, and books to distract them from their true destiny. They were, in his sick way of seeing the world, the fertile ground where he dreamed of planting the seed of a perfect heir, free of deformities and strong as a human war machine. He visited them regularly, convinced that his control was absolute and that no desire for rebellion could bloom among golden walls and invisible bars. But he did not count on the defiance that would grow among these women when Furiosa, his most valuable lieutenant, was assigned as their guardian and confidant. Together they imagined another future, a mythical green place, an impossible utopia called the Green Place of Many Mothers. That hope drove them to plan the escape that would set his reign of fear ablaze. That act of insurrection sparked the Road War, the frenzied chase of Mad Max. Fury Road. Furious at the betrayal, Joe set out after them, leading his war boys, determined to get them back or die trying. Amid explosions and engines roaring like possessed beasts, Immortan Joe proved that despite his rotting flesh, he was still a monster of unbreakable will. He sacrificed his followers without remorse, threw vehicles, lives, and fuel into the storm of dust and shrapnel, and faced Furiosa and Max without ever letting go of the wheel of his fury. One moment captures him better than 1,000 speeches, when one of his wives, Angharad, falls under the wheels of his convoy, Joe. In a twisted flicker of humanity, swerves his monstrous vehicle to avoid crushing her. Seeing her dead, he roars like a wounded animal betrayed by his own flesh. Because to him, these women were not mere slaves. They were the key to his immortality, the illusion that something of his rotten flesh would survive through a clean and powerful bloodline. In the climax of the hunt, Joe pays his debt to mortality. Furiosa, wounded but as relentless as the desert itself, faces him hand to hand. With a calculated strike, she rips off his mask, hooks his metal jaw to a chain, and the gear of his own vehicle finishes the job. The face that embodied the illusion of immortality is torn apart, burying once and for all the myth of the immortal man. The image of his corpse, exposed at the Citadel by Furiosa and her allies, broke the spell. The dispossessed saw the truth. Their god was nothing more than a rotting man, dependent on tubes, metal, and empty promises. Hungry for justice, they symbolically devoured his body, stripping him of every insignia of power, tearing apart his mask, his armor, and with them, every lie that had bound them. No one would ever fear him again, because no one fears a specter once they know it bleeds like any other mortal. To understand Joe's downfall, one must remember how he inspired terror with just his presence. Steel-jawed mask, gray mane like a ghost's veil, plastic armor barely containing the decaying, suppurating flesh under layers of white powder. He wore massive pistols slung across his chest, like trophies of a military past, and flaunted rusted medals that recalled war glories that existed only in his mind. Under the desert's scorching sun, he looked like an armored phantom, a prophet of speed and gunpowder. But in reality, his respirator and the constant assistance of his son Rictus were the only reason that myth could stand at all. In his twisted mind, Immortan Joe was no mere dictator. He believed himself a redeemer. He manipulated his people with fiery speeches about mechanical glory and controlled showers of water that fell like miracles, making clear who decided who drank and who died of thirst. His cult grew from desperation, speed, gasoline, and death, a moving altar of scrap and gunpowder. The war boys idolized him as a mechanical god, shaving their heads, painting death on their skin, and decorating their bodies with scars as marks of faith. They hurled themselves onto the road like human projectiles, seeking the glorious death that promised them a place in a paradise that, in truth, existed only in his mind. His greatest strength was not his decrepit body, but his seasoned general's mind, a blend of military cunning, boundless violence, and a perverse talent for turning hopelessness into blind obedience. His victories were not just the product of gunpowder or gasoline, but of his gift for convincing hundreds of fanatics that dying for him was the only thing that gave meaning to their miserable lives. But even the most fearsome empires carry the seeds of their own destruction. In his old age, his frail body became his Achilles' heel. His obsession with leaving a perfect heir made him neglect those who had the will to slip through his iron grip. And his blind fury, the same that kept him alive, was what led him straight into the trap set by Furiosa and a lone rebel named Max Rockatansky. Thus fell Immortan Joe, a tyrant forged by radiation, fire, and dust, turned into a broken legend when his mask shattered before everyone. His death not only freed the Citadel, but proved that no man, no matter how much he proclaims himself immortal, can escape the Wasteland's simplest truth. Flesh rots, gasoline runs out, and metal gods always end up rusting under the sun.